Today it will be a big one. I might have a plausible explanation of why the first portrayal of Longpoint, langort position in 133 looks like this, with the sword pointing down. And it might mean that priest's long point is in fact something different than the long point in all other medieval fencing systems. This will probably be a longer video, but I am creating chapters here, so if you don't want to look through all of it, you can skip to the conclusions at the end. But I believe it is necessary to present whole my reasoning about this topic, because I think this is pretty big. So the long point position is first presented to us at the very beginning of 133, where there is this overview of 7 basic positions, 7 basic custodia that all fencers use. And of these 7 positions, the last one, the 7th one, is called long point, langort, and it is the most important position. The text at this position says that whole core of the art of fencing lies in this very position. And it also says that all actions of the sword are determined by this position. Or in other words, this is what the text says, all the actions have their end in langort. So this is a very strong statement, and I was interpreting this statement for a long time in the same way as all the other interpreters. Because in the place of 133, we can see a lot of examples where the priest's action ends with a thrust. Especially you have several places about omitting the bind, where the action starts with a cut, say a half shield cut, but as soon as the cut hits the opponent's shield, hits the obstacle, you should immediately turn it into a thrust to go behind the shield and hit the opponent. So the thrust naturally leads to the long point position. So it makes sense that if you want to end your offensive actions with thrust, you will naturally end in long point position. So this makes sense. Why would you do it? Well, the long point here is probably used first to deliver the thrust that is more dangerous, more powerful than a cut. So this may be the reason why the priest wants to finish everything with thrust, because this is the killing blow. And also there is this possibility of the long point position go around the obstacle and strike behind the obstacle. So the priest is probably using both of these. And because you see many examples of these things in 133, in the place of omitting the bind, and also in other places where the play ends with some of the fencers doing a stich, a thrust, and the text says that now the scholar should do a stich because this is a common thing that priest always does. Things like that are all over the place in 133. So it makes sense that the long point position, the natural ending position of any thrust, is this finish of everything. So this is how all the interpreters understood this statement about long point. But there is this problem about the image, because the image looks like this. The image is showing the first image of long point, like the ideal, the template image of a position in the overview of all positions, not in the play, not a position that is like modified by the needs of the combat. This is the template the template portrayal of a position. And this template portrayal of long point is pointing the sword down. This is very weird, because all the medieval fencing systems, and most probably not only them, include the long point position or some equivalent of long point position in their system. And the idea of long point position is always the same. It is and extend it forward and pointing towards the opponent, threatening the opponent. So you should have the point at the opponent, either at his face or at his chest, but certainly towards the opponent, because you want to present a threat towards the opponent. So that if the opponent wants to attack you, he first needs to deal with the danger that you are imposing on him. And only then he can attack you. So there is this like first level of defense. And also there is the power in Longpoint that can take the smallest gap, smallest opening that he gives you and thrust in there and deliver a very powerful strike in the very small gap. So there is this idea of Longpoint being an extreme danger for the opponent, a threat, an extreme threat that he has to deal with. And all of these long points are defined. The defining feature of these positions is the fact that you are threatening the opponent, that you are pointing at him. But this is not what we see in the first image of Longpoint in 133. From this point of view, it is very weird that you present your Longpoint position like this, without pointing your sword towards the opponent, because this defeats the very purpose of Longpoint in all other fencing systems. In fact, other fencing systems also have a position like this, some of them. But this is not called a long point. This is a different thing from long point. This position is different from this position, because this position is not directly threatening your opponent. So it may be a useful position, and you may fight from it. You may have some techniques that start in this position or end in this position, but it is not a long point, because it doesn't have the defining features of the long point that the system needs. But the priest in 133, when he first presents his template ideal version of long point, he is showing exactly this, pointing down. For some time, I thought that this might be like a weird image. We know that 133 is full of weird portrayals of positions. And in general, if you interpret the manual, you tend to think that, well, some details are not important because the images are always weirdly distorted. So you tend to disregard the details of the images. But recently, I have developed my understanding of the images of 133. I have done a long video about it like a month ago. And I believe I can decode what the images mean. I believe the images have rules, and if you follow the rules, you can understand the reality behind the image. So the details in the image are not arbitrary. They have reasons, and it is possible to decode these images and get to the starting real-life position. And based on this way of analyzing the image of Longpoint in the first portrayal, in the first overview of positions, is in fact showing a position that has the sword pointing down. So when the illustrators, the painters, were painting the image, they were looking at the priest who was showing them a real-life, ideal position of Longpoint in this way. Or it might have been in this way. So the sword might have been at like the shoulder level, but still the sword is not pointing towards the opponent. It is either pointing down or to the side, but not in this way. Because this is not what we see in the image. So the image is certainly not showing a position that presents a threat towards the opponent, which is very different from understanding of all long points in all other fencing systems. When I was making my latest videos about the rebind, I might have stumbled upon the explanation. Because I was looking through the manual and looking at the images and reading the text, And I have found that Longpoint, langort position in 133 is mentioned several times in the text. And in the place, it is always portrayed with the sword pointed forward, like this, but certainly with the sword pointed forward. So this is a very different portrayal from the basic template that points the sword down. But I have also noticed that this position with the arms straight and the sword pointing down is in fact used also very often in 133. This is the position, the ending position of a rebind, or ending position of mutatio gladi, or a position in which you will get naturally during the combat, in a position in which you fight in the bind. This is the position that you reach. And this gave me the idea. So I went back to the overview of position, to the text describing the langort position. But I have looked not in the translation, but in the original Latin text. And the original Latin text is using the word determinantur. Actus determinantur in ea, in custodia, langort custodia. Actions are determined by langort position. This is how it is translated. But the problem is that the word determinantur, it really can mean that something is determined, something is defined by another. But the word has also another meaning, and this is the meaning that is connected to the usage of preposition in that we see in 133. Actus determinantur in ea, in custodia, so langort custodia. So this is the preposition that they use. And determinantur in means more something like is confined with it, or is delimited by, is that something sets boundaries to it. So it is not about defining the action, it is about limiting the action. Longpoint is what limits the other actions, what sets boundaries to the other actions. I can't be absolutely sure that this is the correct translation, but it certainly hints at the idea of langort putting limits to other actions, and it makes sense. It would turn the whole statement the other way around. It is not about attacking, it is not about thrusting. It is in fact about dealing with the opponent's actions. The actions that the text is talking about are not your actions, they are the opponent's actions. And your Longpoint can put boundaries to the actions of the opponent. Because what you can do with Longpoint and not with any other position from the basic set of 7 positions is that you can reach into the space of the opponent and take the bind and control the opponent's sword. This is what only Longpoint can do, not any other positions. And this may be the way how you use Longpoint to limit the actions of the opponent. Because if you are touching the opponent's sword, if you are in the bind, the opponent no longer can do what he wants to do, because you are limiting his possibilities. He can't go through your sword because you are controlling, partially controlling what he is doing. And in this way, you can thwart his actions. You can put them to an end. And that is why the text says that all actions of the sword have their end in Longpoint, because you can use Longpoint to end these actions. For example, by a rebind, because a rebind naturally leads to a Longpoint. And if you consider Longpoint in this way, then the defining feature of the Longpoint is not the fact that you are threatening your opponent. Defining feature of the Longpoint would be the fact that you are reaching forward. Your arm is straight and your sword is extension of your arm, and you are reaching forward with your sword. That is what would define Longpoint in the priest system. And it is so important because in this way, you can reach to what the opponent is doing and thwart it and remove it, cancel what he is doing, stop his action. That is what you can do if you reach inside his action. And in this way, there would be not much difference between this long point and this long point, and maybe this long point or this long point. All of these could be long point, because long point is in fact a position that you are using when fighting in the bind. If you are pushing, you are doing a rebind, you are pushing the opponent's sword. You start in a long point and move in a long point and end in a long point. And if he pushes you, you want to do mutatio gladi. And the whole mutatio gladi is happening inside long point, because all of these positions are long point. Because the feature, the defining feature of the long point is not the fact that you are threatening the opponent, but the fact that you are reaching forward with the weapon. And this would mean, this would explain why the basic image, the first image of long point that we see, is showing the sword down. Because it is okay, you can use long point for threatening your opponent. But the defining feature of long point is the fact that you can reach inside the space of the opponent and to work with his sword and to work in the bind. And this means that this position emphasizes this defensive or like binding feature of long point more than this one. So that was my conclusion, and I believe it makes a lot of sense. It explains the weird image of long point with the sword pointing down. It fits in 133 because we know that binding and the fight in the bind is extremely important for the priest. And if you consider long point a position that you use in the bind, well then long point is the most important position for the priest. So it makes sense why it is a core of all fencing, because this is the position of the binding of all binding actions. It would explain why what the text means by telling us that all actions are determined by this position. In fact, it means that they are limited by this position. That this position, the long point, can limit all the actions what the opponent is doing, because it can reach into the bind. And it can end these actions. So all the actions can have their end in your long point. And not in the others, because no other of the 7 basic positions reach with the sword forward. It only long point does this. It would mean that the priest's definition of long point is broader than the definition of long point that other fencing systems use. Because for other fencing systems, all that I know, long point is about threatening the opponent with the tip pointing forward. But for the priest, this is a long point, but also any position here that you use in binding is long point. So it is like a broader definition that includes the traditional, the classical, not traditional, classical definition of long point, because priest's long point also can threaten the opponent. But it also can be used in the bind. And the basic core idea of long point is about being able to work in the bind. So it is generally pretty defensive. Or, well, the bind, you can also use the bind offensively, but this would be the idea. So that's it. It is kind of unintuitive interpretation of a long point position, because usually it is a lot about threatening. But in fact, it can explain a lot of weirdness in 133. And it doesn't contradict anything that 133 says about the long point. It just gives it a different meaning. And I believe a better meaning, more truthful. So, that's it.